Welcome back to the post game. Michael Brooks here. Joining us now is our official debunker, Ben Burgis. He teaches logic at Rutgers University. He's the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, which is going to be available in pre-order from Zero Books in about a week or two. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
That's very exciting, Ben. So it's actually good because the debunk you're doing tonight can lead into some teases for my book. So
yeah.
There's a little thing called synergy, to paraphrase Steve Klubeck. So over this weekend, or I guess Monday primarily, Sam Harris, I don't even remember. I think the way this argument started was Murtaza Hussain, who is a friend of mine and of the show, who's a great reporter at The Intercept, noted, I think, the similarities in the Church Christ terrorist manifesto on birth rates and some of Sam Harris's writing on birth rates. And of course, Sam Harris, like a whirling dervish of whiny aggrievement, launched into action and was like, I don't remember actually what he said. I don't know if we have the tweet in front of us, but it was unfair, I'm sure, and yada, yada, yada. Matt, where are we starting here? We have the Mehdi Hassan tweet to start us.
Murtaza Hassan.
This is Mehdi Hassan.
Oh, this is
Murtaza. Murtaza Hussain is the one who started it.
So I have the original ones where the Murtaza thing started, and basically, I don't know if you can see here. I can make this bigger. This is the original thing where Sam Harris was basically.
Okay, this is the original Sam Harris quote. And I'm sure that, it's like all Sam Harris quotes, and only Sam Harris and a small group of Redditors can properly interpret it. But let's just read it on its face. Islam is the fastest growing religion in Europe. The demographic trends are ominous. Given current rates, France could be a majority Muslim country in 25 years. And that is if immigration were to stop tomorrow. Basically, Murtaza noted this, and
Sam Harris tried to defend it, saying where it came from, but it basically comes from some Islamophobic crank that had some concept of Eurabia.
Right, and Harris didn't sort of respond to the substance of it. He just said, needless to say, I never knowingly publish false statistics. There's also a difference between false statistics and demographic trends that change. This is a dumb smear, which ironically seems to accept the inflammatory logic of the original point.
And then just to catch us up to the Mehdi thing, Mehdi jumped into this thread basically saying, how can you do this? Sam Harris responded to Mehdi by posting some old clip of Mehdi Hassan, and I didn't even watch that clip. It was something that it was taken out of context, and Mehdi has disavowed it numerous times, unlike Sam Harris and this Eurabia concept, for instance. So, yeah.
So, and that takes us up to, I'll just read this Mehdi thing, and then you can take us through all you want to take us through, Ben. Sam Harris launched a personal attack on me, cynically trying to smear me based on ancient edited remarks I long ago disavowed and repeatedly regretted and apologized for. So here's a thread of 15 years of his own bigoted, offensive remarks that he's never apologized for. Actually, let me read one or two. It's time that we admitted that we are not at war with terrorism, we're at war with Islam. Sam Harris, 2004. Muslim immigrants often show little inclination to acquire secular and civic values in their host countries, demanding tolerance for their backwardness, their misogyny, and anti-Semitism. Sam Harris, 2004. Islam, more than any other religion human beings have devised, has all of the makings of a thoroughgoing cult of death. Sam Harris, 2004. And final one. The gravity of Jewish suffering over the ages culminating in the Holocaust made it impossible to entertain any suggestion that Jews might have brought their own troubles upon themselves. This, however, is rather a narrow sense true. That is the perfect Sam Harris quote. Sam Harris, End of Faith, 2004. Okay, Ben, come on, man. Hit us with some logic. What's going on?
So one thing I was just going to point out is that it's amazing that throughout this discussion, Sam Harris has in a lot of ways acted like a right-wing version of a character of like an SJW woke lord. That he's that for one thing he wants to cancel Mehdi Hassan for something he said decades ago. That he's since disavowed, and he's also, in response to my favorite part of all this, when Juan Cole came on to correct a lot of what Harris was saying, Harris sort of sent out the bat signal for everybody he knows who was raised Muslim to come flock to Twitter to defend him. That they have I'm Islamophobic, am I? Well, you're not Muslim at all. And, what about, my friends Abdul and Mahmoud and, come tell me, come say how cool I am, right? So the whole move here is to say that even though, as Juan Cole pointed out in this discussion, I was studying the Quran in Cairo before you were born, right? That they have that the lived experience of anybody who was raised Muslim just automatically trumps everything that Juan Cole knows about the subject, right? So,
the ultimate standpoint epistemology argument, actually, in its most overdone, absurd variety that these guys are supposedly always complaining about.
Exactly. Now, also, I did watch the original Mehdi Hassan clip, and Mehdi Hassan says a lot of bad things in the clip. It's it's good, homophobic things, for example. It's good that he's disavowed it. But he's not, it's not like he was an Al-Qaeda supporter 15 years ago.
Right.
He's actually explicitly denouncing violence as being incompatible with Islam in the clip, which is going to be important when we get to what Harris is trying to do with it. So the basic thing that Harris is doing is what Harris always does. It's one of his key moves, which is a version of the equivocation fallacy we've talked about before with Jordan Peterson, where you're using keywords or phrases to mean different things in different parts of the argument. It's a variant of that's sometimes called the Motte-and-bailey argument. So the idea is, it's taken from a visual analogy from an old kind of castle where you had the motte, the courtyard around it. And then if you were attacked there, you could retreat into the bailey, right? The castle itself. And so the idea is that the motte is some reasonable reading of your claim that you can, the motte is where you spend most of your time. The motte is what he's actually trying to get at when he says these things about Islam and Muslim immigrants, and everybody understands what he's saying, right?
Right. Yeah.
You're supposed to understand it that way. But the idea is that if you're attacked in the motte, you can retreat to the bailey, which is this super narrow reading of what you meant. It's all I said was... And then, he'll give some really anodyne, version of what he said. That's clearly not all he said.
Oh, this is always, I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is always the move, right? This is and let's just say, because we'll deal with this later, but let's say it's something like, and if you say that I'm saying this is it, you're taking me out of context and smearing me. But say you write something like, there might be a scenario that we have to preemptively nuke countries in the Middle East. And then when you're called on saying something like that, not that, and if you say I'm talking about that, you're totally taking me out of context, then you basically pivot to a version of all I'm saying is that Al-Qaeda is bad.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Which is what Harris, of course, did when Hassan trotted out these 15 instances over the last 15, years of Harris saying insanely Islamophobic things.
Right.
And it's also important because... So what Harris wants to do is say that all he wants to do is... all he's doing is criticizing Islam. Anybody who's interpreting him as saying anything bigoted or racist is taking him out of context. They're misreading him. They're misinterpreting him, which is also funny because another point I want to make about this is that in the Mehdi Hassan exchange, right, the first thing that Harris said to him, right, was, you used to be a religious bigot, right? And then he had this clip, and he said, so is it the case that if you denounce it, and then his trick is to say, if you're really denouncing it, then you can't accuse me of being an Islamophobe for criticizing these views.
Oh,
so, which is amazing because, first of all, Harris's defense is always that he's not saying, when he says that Muslim immigrants are backwards, so we should be really worried about them, when he says that
the people who are the most realistic about the threat posed to Europe by Muslim immigration are fascists, right? That's a almost word for word Harris quote. You know, he always says, "Oh no, I'm not doing bigotry against Muslims. I don't know where you're getting that idea. All I'm doing is criticizing Islam." So as long as his claim is that the reason that Muslims are backwards and this and that and the other thing dangerous is because of the content of Islam, then he can't be accused of bigotry for saying this. But hold on, he's saying that Mehdi Hassan was a religious bigot because in this old clip he says that like people who aren't practicing Islam, you know, are like animals. But of course that's a horrible thing to say, but by Sam Harris's standards, that shouldn't count as bigotry because, you know, Hassan, you know, the old version of Hassan was attributing everything that was wrong with the non-Muslim population to the fact that they weren't believing and practicing Islam. So either saying, "Oh, I was criticizing their ideas," is a get out of jail free pass for accusations of bigotry, or it's not. If it is, then Mehdi Hassan wasn't a religious bigot 15 years ago. And if it's not, then Sam Harris can't use that defense either. Last point about this is that when he says, "Oh, if Mehdi Hassan has truly gotten over his religious bigotry, that he can't criticize me for being an Islamophobe," right? Because the idea is that Sam Harris is just criticizing Islamic fundamentalism, so anybody who really wasn't an Islamic fundamentalist anymore would be fine with that, wouldn't accuse Harris of Islamophobia, and that's a false dilemma wrapped in a straw man. So.
Is that that sounds like a biography of Sam Harris. All right, sorry.
Yeah, no,
wrapped
that
in a trust
actually
fund.
would be.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Ad homs.
Wrapped in a straw man, the Sam Harris story. But yeah, absolutely, because you know it's a straw man because of course nobody is actually saying that Harris is a horrible person and a bigot because he's criticizing Islamic fundamentalism. Right? Lots of people criticize Islamic fundamentalism and don't get accused of being bigots or anything like that. Everybody in the discussion is against Islamic fundamentalism. In fact, for that matter, lots of people criticize religion in general or Islam, and but of course you can make a distinction between that and what Harris does when he says that Muslim immigrant populations are backwards and they're a threat to Europe and we should profile them and torture them and possibly nuke them, although I'm just doing a thought experiment.
Right.
So the idea, so this is both a severe misrepresentation, a straw man of what people are actually criticizing when they criticize Harris, and a ridiculous false dilemma because there are more options than being cool with Islamic fundamentalism and thinking, and being cool with what Harris is saying, right? It's not that your two choices are either to have no problem with even the most extreme versions of Islamic thought or to agree with Sam Harris about everything. And I think maybe part of him knows that because one thing that really struck me, I don't know if this was your impression when you were looking over this whole exchange, but is that Harris almost seemed like he was kind of tired of his own bullshit at this point. Like Harris, instead of writing a new, 6,000 word screed like he usually would in these situations, he just linked Hassan to something that he wrote years ago. And Hassan actually repeatedly pointed out in the Twitter exchange, hey, but wait a second, you aren't just criticizing, Islamic ideas. You're saying that Muslim immigrants are backwards and all this stuff. And Harris didn't really engage with that. It's almost like he's kind of at this point he's been saying this stuff for so long that's okay, I need to go through the motions for the fans. But
I also noticed. I also noticed when he said that Mehdi was a CNN contributor, which was interesting because it's false. But I guess he's on CNN a lot. It's not the biggest error in the world. But somebody pointed out that the place that called him a CNN contributor apparently was Breitbart. So it's also like intimating that literally maybe Sam Harris is like reading Breitbart, which is just actually like an incredible embarrassment in and of itself. But like, yeah, no, I did kind of get that impression, but it also struck me that part of what's happening is a broader shift of narrative and some combination of the fact that, you know, I don't exactly know when things started to change. I mean, I think certainly people like, you know, for years, Omar Aziz, Glenn Greenwald, you know, plenty of people, frankly, me, starting on YouTube a couple years ago, were quite willing to robustly critique the, you know, obvious, you know, massive flaws, historical errors, and incredibly disturbing sort of intimations of Harris's, you know, just simplistic work. But I think partially what's happening is there's, and I don't know if you'll like this because but not the version you're talking about. You know, you're saving and depolluting the rhetoric of logic to actually get us to a point where we can actually use these methodologies to have a coherent conversation. But it felt like, yeah, I don't know, that there's been enough sort of pushback against just the sort of fundamental doltishness of like what someone like Sam Harris is doing, that, you know, that maybe there's a slight upgrade in people's ability to like read and think a little contextually. And there in turn, yeah, that Sam Harris is also, yeah. And I also do think he did seem kind of sick of it because I think, like, you know, the new stuff is, you know, I mean, the last big thing was his, you know, embrace of racist IQ stuff. That was his last kind of major public melodrama. And also maybe, you know, he obviously still wants this kind of broad recognition, but maybe there's something that's nice. Like, you know, it's hard to debate Murtaza Hussain and Mehdi Hassan and Juan Cole. It's very easy to sit and, you know, talk to Dave Rubin. I mean, my God.
That's right.
You know?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So Dave Rubin is certainly not going to challenge him on his abysmal ignorance of history, which is one of the big threads. You know, you're talking about previewing the themes of your book,
right?
You know, which I've been lucky enough to read some of what you've written, and and you know, that's a big theme there, because that's really one of the things that connects a lot of the things that Harris is wrong about, and not just wrong, but like sort of gallingly, like, you know, with this weird way, given that he wants to be Mr. Science, like he's almost like proudly ignorant about a lot of factual information that pertains to these things, like you know, like in the race IQ debate, right? One of his most memorable statements was, "The history doesn't matter."
Literally says this to Ezra Klein in a, you know, whiny, aggrieved manner. The history is irrelevant, and that's
right.
That is, I mean, that's quite a take in general for basically discussing almost like any topic outside of like really, really narrow math questions. And
right.
And when you're talking specifically about the history of race in the United States and the construction of intelligence and human classification systems, to say that the history is irrelevant, I mean, that is that's a take there. But I think, yeah, and it does intersect, because part of my, as you know, my argument is not just that, I mean, of course, they're all ahistorical, but the subtext, and in that quote, I mean, Harris's work is essentially aggressively anti-historical. And in fact, you know, obviously, I think a proper, thorough historic reading does lead to some version of left politics, whatever, you know, there's huge flexibility and range in that. But I think, frankly, like, you could even say just more broadly, I mean, you could still even have more right-wing conclusions, but you could just not, it would be impossible to have this sort of like complete, just utter limit of range of talking about profoundly important and really complicated areas, and basically think that like some combination of like stats and, you know, your own sort of self-directed thought experiments can get you there, is actually methodologically reckless and a war on most ways of human knowing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, and it's not. I mean, look, you might be able to come to like broadly right-wing conclusions about this if you're willing to, bite enough bullets in terms of the underlying morality of what you were saying.
Right.
But you certainly couldn't come to the to just these like aggressively reductive, simplistic conclusions that he's come into, right? Like that.
It'd be impossible.
That Harris. Yeah, exactly. That like Harris wants to say, oh, the explanation for why Al Qaeda exists is that look at these violent passages in the Quran, which
right.
is which really raises some pretty obvious questions about the millennia and a half or so that Islam existed, but Al Qaeda did not. And when he says the history is irrelevant about race and IQ, like he's saying that all we should look at is this snapshot, right? That like, oh, here's how everybody's doing on IQ tests right now, and anything that would cause like educational disparities, et cetera, right? Like I always thought that the best line on this came from Nathan Robinson in his takedown of Harris, his takedown of Charles Murray, who Harris was defending there. That Murray says that Murray's big evidence that you can't blame the historical oppression of African Americans for white-black IQ differentials in the contemporary United States is that in the incredibly limited superficial data there is from what IQ testing has happened in Africa, that the African IQ tests are also bad, right? And Robinson has this beautiful line in there about how like, okay, some of this testing comes from the Congo. We want to talk about the history of Belgian imperialism in the Congo and how that could lead to how that might also be relevant, and says that it might have been a little bit difficult for people to hold their pencils for their IQ tests after King Leopold cut off their hands.
Yep. No, that's exactly it. Exactly. And then even the more sort of provocative, take, which I treated this when we covered it, extensively, and had people like Eric Turkheimer on this show as let's take the science on its own terms and debunk it. But I mean, I think IQ is a nonsense concept, and that might bother some people. And it's funny, and I guess I should make clear at this point that all the vaccination jokes are jokes. IQ, no, I'm not joking. I think that this is a pernicious test. I think there's very sound critiques of it, and I think it's frankly, business and bureaucratically, it's a self-licking ice cream cone. I actually, Nassim Taleb is a genuinely heterodox thinker who is very fun, but also kind of at times super buffoonish and has some really bad takes and some really good takes, but whatever. But I think his writing on IQ is great, and I agree. So
and this does tie into a bigger problem with Harris that we talked about a few weeks ago when I was on the show, which is that it's one thing to say, okay, you can scientifically test something, but first you have to figure out what it is that you're testing.
Right.
And this ties into the facts value problem for Harris, that he thinks science by itself can tell us, which moral or political goals we should care about, which is just incoherent.
Right.
And it also ties into the IQ thing, because if you don't have a coherent, well thought out operational view of what it is exactly that this test is supposed to test, then all the data from IQ tests in the world don't add up to anything.
Right. Exactly. Ben Burgis, you will be back on next week for another edition of the Debunk, and also back in studio soon. Of course, guys, you got to read this book. Give them an argument. Logic for the Left. As soon as it's available on pre-order, I'll be tweeting it out. And Ben, thanks a million as always.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right, brother.
Bye.
You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe